the just war theory posits that a war is justified if it meets at least 4 of 7 conditions. It's very popular in many religious circles, particularly Christianity and Catholicism. Seems fair enough, at least in my opinion, but someone who's either vehemently anti-war or a staunch patriot or nationalist might disagree. But before we get into that, I want to give a warm welcome to anyone who's new to my channel. If you like today's video, go to my channel page to see the wide array of content on religion and spirituality I have to offer here at A World of Spirituality. If you find it's the kind of channel you're looking for, you know which 2 buttons to click so you can get even more. First, we're going to talk about what just war theory has to say about what needs to happen before you can go to war. The first is competent authority. Simply put, a war can only be waged by a leader with legitimate political authority in a sovereign state. Individuals or groups without such authority cannot wage a war, even if the next 3 criteria are met. Even if the one waging a war is an authority in the government, they must prove themselves to have the morality and decision-making skills necessary to ensure all other criteria of this doctrine are met. The next of which is just cause. Even a legitimate authority can't just declare a war because they feel like it. They can't declare war just for the purpose of retrieving stolen goods, upholding or spreading an ideology, or assisting in their re-election. It must be for the purpose of defending the rights of citizens or justice for innocent lives taken. But even that isn't enough to wage a just war. Even if a sovereign state needs to defend the rights of citizens or do justice to innocent lives taken, they first have to try more peaceful methods of obtaining those goals. But if negotiation, diplomacy, economic sanctions, and other attempts to resolve the conflict prove futile, war may just be necessary and therefore permissible. But there's still one more thing to consider, and that's probability of success. The devastation inevitably caused by war isn't worth it if the goal of waging the war isn't achieved. So one final consideration before waging a war is whether the use of force will, in fact, guarantee the rights of citizens or attain any other reasonable goal for a war. Moreover, the result of the successful war must far outweigh the damage caused and the lives lost as a result of the war. Next, we're going to talk about what just war theory posits about right conduct within war. The first of these is distinction. When you're at war, it's really unrealistic to promise not to kill anyone. But that doesn't mean you can kill just anyone. The only people you're allowed to kill are enemy combatants. No civilians and no combatants on your side who you become angry with. No bombing civilian residential areas with no legitimate military targets. And definitely no attacking neutral targets. Next is proportionality or military necessity. War, by its very nature, causes death and destruction. But even when you have a just cause to go to war, efforts must be made to keep the amount of deaths and degree of destruction to a bare minimum, and only do that which is necessary to achieve the goal of the war. The positive outcome anticipated by an attack or strategy must be highly likely and must far outweigh the harm that will be caused to civilians and civilian property. And lastly, no means that are malum in se. Simply put, anything that's evil in itself is out. This includes, but isn't limited to, mass rape, forcing enemy combatants to fight against each other, and using weapons whose effects cannot be controlled. Not only do these things do nothing to advance the cause of a war, but they cause devastation that no positive outcome can ever justify or make up for. There's recently been an addendum to just war theory, positing that there are also rules of conduct for after a war. This is called Jus Ad Bellum and has been proposed by theorists such as Gary Bass and Brian Oren. It concerns stuff like peace treaties, reconstruction, environmental remediation, war crime trials, and war reparations. This is especially important when you consider that so many wars have been made unjust by unethical actions off of the traditional battlefield, and that after effects continue long after a war has ended. Those who criticize just war theory tend to do so from one of two angles. From the angle of nationalism, or believing that supporting the interests of a country through any means necessary take precedence over any moral issues that come up in just war doctrine, and from the anti-war and pacifist angle, which believes that contrary to just war doctrine, war is never justified under any circumstances. Some Christians on the nationalistic side believe that God commands us to wage war in His name, therefore, we are to do this without regard to the commands of the just war theory. They also argue that the overriding aim of war should be to achieve victory as quickly and as cheaply as possible, so there should not be any restrictions on this. It makes sense for them to argue this when you consider that in the Bible, God is frequently on the side of those waging wars that don't conform to just war doctrine. So why would people on the other extreme criticize just war theory? Well, pacifists and anti-war movements posit that all war is unjust and no ethical theory can ever support it on any grounds. People on this side believe that deliberate violence, including that used in war, must always be opposed, and merely restraining it isn't enough. To them, just war doctrine claims that the deliberate violence of war is okay given that it meets certain conditions, and this is something that the anti-war movement and pacifism refuse to accept. As I'm always doing here at A World of Spirituality, I'm now going to take a look at what different religions and spiritualities throughout history have had to say on just war theory. Recent studies have found that just war doctrine may date as far back as ancient Egypt. Egyptian ethics of war usually centered on three main ideas: the cosmological role of Egypt, the pharaoh as a divine office and executor of the will of the gods, and the superiority of the Egyptian state and population over all other states and peoples. The principle of Ma'at, signifying order and justice, was central to the Egyptian notion of just war and its ability to guarantee Egypt virtually no limits on what it could take, do, or use to guarantee the ambitions of the state. So they had Jus Ad Bellum criteria to meet before waging a war, but no Jus in Bello criteria for how the war could and could not be fought. One of the first written discussions of a just war can be found in the ancient Hindu epic Mahabharata. In it, one of 5 ruling brothers, or Pandavas, asks if the suffering caused by war can ever be justified. A long discussion then ensues between the siblings, establishing criteria like proportionality, like chariots cannot attack cavalry, only other chariots, no attacking people in distress, etc. Just means, meaning no poisoned or barbed arrows, and just cause, no attacking out of rage, as well as fair treatment of captives and the wounded. Chinese philosophers produced a massive body of work on warfare, much of it during the Zhou dynasty, especially during the Warring States era. According to them, war was justified only as a last resort and only by the rightful sovereign. However, questioning the decision of the emperor concerning the necessity of a military action was not permissible. The success of a military campaign was sufficient proof that the campaign had been righteous. It was Aristotle who first introduced the concept and terminology to the Hellenic world that called war a last resort, requiring conduct that would allow the restoration of peace. Aristotle argues that the cultivation of a military is necessary and good for the purpose of self-defense, not for conquering it. Specifically, he said that the proper object of practicing military training is not in order that the men may enslave those who do not deserve slavery, but in order that first they may themselves avoid becoming enslaved to others. Christianity has a lot to say about just war theory, and it's said to have all started with St. Augustine of Hippo. He quoted Romans 13:4 to explain that God has given the sword of government for good reason. Therefore, individuals should never resort immediately to violence. At the same time, St. Augustine asserted in Contra Faustum Maniciem that peacefulness in the face of a grave wrong that could be stopped by only violence would be a sin. Defense of oneself or others could be a necessity, especially when it is authorized by a legitimate authority. In Summa Theologica, St. Thomas Aquinas asserted that it was not always a sin to wage war, and he set out 3 criteria for a just war. First, the war must be waged upon the command of a rightful sovereign, or competent authority. Second, the war needs to be waged for a just cause on account of some wrong the attacked have committed. Thirdly, the warriors must have the right intent, namely to promote good and avoid evil. Aquinas came to the conclusion that a just war could be offensive, and that injustice should not be tolerated just to avoid war. Nevertheless, he argued that violence must only be used as a last resort. On the battlefield, violence was only justified to the extent that it was necessary. Soldiers needed to avoid cruelty, and a just war was limited by the conduct of just combatants. Aquinas argued that it was only in the pursuit of justice that the good intention of a moral act could justify the negative consequences, including the killing of the innocent during a war. The just war doctrine, found in the 1992 Catechism of the Catholic Church, in paragraph 2309, lists 4 strict conditions for legitimate defense by military force. 1. The damage inflicted by the aggressor on the nation or community of nations must be lasting, grave, and certain. 2. All other means of putting an end to it must have been shown to be impractical or ineffective. 3. There must be serious prospects of success. And 4. The use of arms must not produce evils and disorders graver than the evil to be eliminated. The War and Peace section in the Basis of the Social Concept of the Russian Orthodox Church is crucial for understanding the Russian Orthodox Church's attitude towards war. The document offers criteria of distinguishing between an aggressive war, which is unacceptable, and a justified war, attributing the highest moral and sacred value of military acts of bravery to a true believer who participates in a justified war. Additionally, the document considers the just war criteria as developed in Western Christianity to be eligible for Russian Orthodoxy. Therefore, the justified war theory in Western theology is also applicable to the Russian Orthodox Church and to many other Eastern Orthodox churches as well. War is ugly, complicated, and not as black and white as we'd like it to be. And just war doctrine acknowledges that. The way different religions and spiritualities deal with these things is just one thing I make content about here at A World of Spirituality. To hear me discuss two other facets of religion and spirituality the way I just did this one, click one of the links on your screen. If you find yourself doing that and wanting more and more, that might just be a sign that you simply need to add my channel to your list and ask for notifications.